The Galactic Council had made many mistakes in its long history, but this was the worst one yet. In their arrogance, they looked upon Earth, a blue speck among the stars, and declared it tamed. Tamed. A word meant for worlds that had been civilized, domesticated, rendered docile. A classification reserved for planets where the native inhabitants had become harmless, their warlike tendencies crushed under the weight of order, their primal instincts diluted through centuries of enforced peace. They believed that humanity had joined the ranks of the docile. And they couldn't have been more wrong. The announcement. The proclamation was broadcast across every major network in the galaxy. High Chancellor Velvoth, a sleek-furred Veltari, stood before the council chamber, her voice rich with the satisfaction of a species that had never lost a war. After centuries of careful observation and integration, the species known as Homo sapiens has been classified as a tamed civilization. A polite round of applause echoed through the chamber. The insectoid Zelkair clicked their mandibles in approval, the reptilian Dravash rumbled their assent, and the aquatic Kelthai let out a harmonious chime. The humans in attendance? They sat in eerie silence. Not in anger. Not in protest. But something else. Something dangerous. High Chancellor Velvoth continued, oblivious to the weight of the moment. We welcome them fully into the fold of pacified species, and as a gesture of goodwill, we invite them to send their own envoys to the distant frontier worlds where law and order are still being established. The council chamber filled with approving murmurs. Frontier worlds were rough places, lawless, unstable, filled with pirates, raiders, and criminal warlords. The perfect proving ground for newly tamed civilizations. The perfect place to test whether a species had truly left behind its violent ways. The humans said nothing. They only smiled. And the wolves stepped forward. The wolves of Earth. Ambassador Clark was the first to rise. Not a politician, not a bureaucrat, but a soldier. A man with the eyes of someone who had seen war in its ugliest forms. He smoothed his uniform and spoke in a voice that was both measured and deceptively calm. We accept. The words sent a ripple through the chamber. The humans were agreeing? Just like that? Excellent, Velvoth purred, her whiskers twitching. And who shall represent humanity in these frontier missions? Clark turned, and behind him they rose. Not diplomats. Not scholars. But warriors. Special forces operators, grizzled veterans, and hardened survivors. The best of the best. They were the wolves of Earth. The men and women who had hunted terrorists in the mountains, stalked pirates through the void, and bled in the wars that had shaped human history. They did not look like ambassadors. They looked like predators. We volunteer, one of them said, adjusting the combat knife on his belt. The council members hesitated. The humans were supposed to be tamed. They were supposed to send politicians, mediators, civilized representatives. But these were not domesticated creatures. These were wolves dressed as men. And the galaxy had just invited them in. The first assignment. The Screamers of Vashna 4. Vashna 4 was a nightmare world. A lawless frontier colony plagued by Screamers, a mercenary group known for leaving entire settlements in ruin. They didn't just kill. They made examples. Towns burned, civilians disappeared, and the few survivors were left wishing they had died. The council had failed to bring order. The Dravash enforcers had failed to bring order. And now humanity had been given its first test. The wolves were deployed. The arrival. The Vanguard dropped from orbit like a thunderclap, its hull still scorched from atmospheric entry. Inside, the wolves readied their gear in silence. Sergeant Vasquez checked her pulse rifle. Sergeant O'Neill finished sharpening his combat blade. Lieutenant Jensen adjusted the breaching charge on his vest. They weren't diplomats. They were hunters. The council had asked them to show their peaceful nature. They would show them something else. The ship doors opened. And the hunt began. First contact with the Screamers. The Screamers had grown complacent. They were used to dealing with weak council enforcers, creatures afraid to get their hands dirty. They saw the human drop ship and laughed. Council sent some pink skins? One of the raiders sneered. Should be fun. They were still laughing when the first shot rang out. A sniper round punched through his skull, snapping his head back before he even realized he was dead. Chaos erupted. The wolves moved like ghosts, slipping through the darkness, their weapons whispering death. A raider turned to run, only to be caught in a brutal knife strike to the throat. Another tried to fire, but a grenade rolled to his feet, and then he was gone in a flash of light and shrapnel. The wolves did not fight like the council's enforcers. They fought like predators unleashed. It took exactly 6 minutes and 42 seconds for the Screamers to be eradicated. The survivors? There were none. The Council's horror. The Galactic Council had expected the humans to struggle. They had expected negotiations, careful diplomacy, and perhaps a minor skirmish. They had not expected what came next. A single transmission was sent from Vashna 4. Sergeant Vasquez stood in front of a pile of bodies, her combat knife still dripping red. She looked into the camera. Mission complete. Then she smiled. Not a kind smile. A wolf's smile. And across the galaxy the Council realized the truth. Earth had never been tamed. They had simply been waiting. Waiting for someone foolish enough to invite the wolves inside. Vashna 4 was silent. Not the silence of peace, but the silence that follows absolute devastation. The wolves had completed their work. The screamers, merciless raiders who had tormented this world for years, were gone. Not defeated. Not captured. Gone. Their hideouts were reduced to rubble, their leaders executed with precision, their foot soldiers erased with brutal efficiency. The wolves had sent a message not just to Vashna 4 but to the entire galaxy. And now the Council was watching. The Council's response. Chancellor Velvoth stood in the Grand Assembly chamber, her fur bristling with unease. She had watched the footage. The human envoy, Sergeant Vasquez, had stood atop a pile of corpses, smiling into the camera. That image was already spreading across the galactic networks like wildfire. This was not how it was supposed to happen. They had expected humanity to struggle, to falter, to prove their classification as a tame civilization. Instead, they had delivered extermination. This is unacceptable, barked one of the Zelkaer representatives, his mandibles clicking in distress. They didn't pacify the raiders, they butchered them. The humans were given a task, Chancellor Velvoth replied, carefully choosing her words. And they completed it. Too well, rumbled a Dravosh warlord. His yellow eyes burned with something between admiration and fear. This level of ruthlessness cannot be tolerated, the Kelthai delegate interjected, their bioluminescent tendrils flickering with agitation. We need to rein them in. To reassert control. Velvoth sighed. And how do you propose we do that? The chamber fell silent. The problem was clear. Humanity was not like the other species that had been tamed. They did not hesitate. They did not ask for permission. They simply did what needed to be done. And worse, they seemed to enjoy it. The wolves prepare for their next hunt. Back on Vashna 4, the wolves of Earth were already preparing for their next mission. The frontier was vast and this was just the beginning. Sergeant Vasquez leaned against the railing of their makeshift command post, watching as her team checked their gear. Pulse rifles were reloaded, knives were sharpened, and explosives were meticulously prepared. Lieutenant Jensen approached, his expression unreadable. Orders just came in. The Council is sending a diplomatic envoy to discuss our approach. Vasquez smirked. Let me guess. They're not happy? Not at all. Jensen handed her the briefing. But they can't argue with results. The Council wants us to continue operations but with more restraint. Vasquez laughed, a sharp, predatory sound. Restraint? We did them a favor. The only thing these raiders understand is fear. Jensen nodded. Speaking of fear, we intercepted a transmission. Looks like another group of screamers got word of what we did here. They're abandoning their strongholds, scattering. Smart, Vasquez said. Not smart enough. Jensen tapped the holo display, showing a map of a nearby war-torn moon, Torvin 6. The last remnants of the screamers are retreating here, he continued. And they're not alone. We've got reports of another faction moving in. Someone big. Vasquez's grin widened. Looks like we've got work to do. The wolves of Earth did not hesitate. They hunted. And Torvin 6 was about to learn what it meant to be prey. The wolves arrive on Torvin 6. Torvin 6 was a graveyard of broken ships and shattered cities, a desolate moon where warlords thrived and law had long since withered away. It was the perfect battlefield. As the wolves descended, their drop pods slammed into the surface like falling meteors, sending plumes of dust and fire into the air. Within moments they had secured a perimeter, their movements precise, methodical. The enemy didn't even have time to react before the first shot was fired. A screamer outpost exploded into flames. Panicked radio chatter filled the comms. It's them, those monsters from Vashna 4. We need reinforcements. Run. Run. But there was nowhere to run. The wolves were already among them. Blades flashed in the darkness. Gunfire tore through the air. Screams echoed across the barren wastes. It was not a battle. It was a massacre. Within hours, the last Screamer stronghold had fallen. The survivors? There were none. The true enemy reveals itself. Just as the wolves were finishing their hunt, the real enemy emerged. Ships appeared on the horizon, sleek, black, and bristling with weapons. These were no raiders. They were something far worse. The wolves watched as the ships descended, their markings unfamiliar. Then a voice crackled over the comms. "This is Commander Vector of the Sovereign Legion. Your actions have disrupted our operations. Withdraw immediately or be annihilated." The wolves exchanged glances. This was unexpected. The Sovereign Legion was a ghost faction, rumored to operate in the lawless regions of space, but their involvement here? That changed everything. Vasquez keyed her comms. "Lieutenant, get me a sit rep." Jensen scanned the readings. "Those ships are heavy-class assault frigates. We're outnumbered and outgunned." Vasquez smirked. "Good. I was starting to get bored." The battle begins. The first shots came from orbit. The Sovereign Legion's ships fired plasma lances, carving through the ruined cityscape, forcing the wolves to scatter. But if the Legion thought this would be easy, they were about to learn the hard way. The wolves did not retreat. They adapted. Jensen gave the order. "Bring down those ships." The wolves launched a coordinated counterattack. Portable railguns fired into the sky, striking engines and forcing enemy vessels to crash land. Explosive charges were set in key locations, turning the battlefield into a death trap. One by one the enemy ships fell. And then the wolves moved in. The Sovereign Legion was strong. But strength alone was not enough. The wolves were faster, deadlier, unpredictable. Within hours the tide had turned. By morning the Sovereign Legion had been routed. Their ships burned. Their commanders lay dead. And their soldiers? Those who survived did not dare fight. They only begged. The wolves of Earth had won. Again. The galaxy takes notice. Word spread. The wolves had not only eradicated the Screamers, they had defeated an army. The Galactic Council was thrown into chaos. The debate raged. Had they made a mistake? Had they misunderstood humanity? Or worse, had they unleashed something they could never control? Chancellor Velvoth listened to the arguments. And for the first time in her long career, she felt fear. The air above Torvin 6 still burned. Columns of black smoke twisted into the sky, mingling with the acrid scent of molten metal and scorched bodies. The Sovereign Legion, an elite force that had once terrorized the lawless frontiers, was now reduced to wreckage and whispers. And the wolves of Earth stood in the ruins, victorious. But there was no time to celebrate. The Galactic Council had taken notice. And they were not pleased. "A leash for the wolves." Chancellor Velvoth stared at the transmission feed in silence. The image of a Legion officer, stripped of his armor, bleeding in the dust, begging for mercy, flickered on the screen. He had not received it. The wolves did not take prisoners. The chamber was in uproar. "This is not what we agreed upon," shrieked the Kelthi delegate, their tendrils spasming in outrage. "We granted the humans this mission to prove themselves as a civilized species. Instead, they've turned into feral killers." "The Sovereign Legion was a threat to our order," countered the Dravash warlord, his scaled lips curling into what might have been a grin. "They eliminated it. You should be thanking them." Velvoth rapped her claws against the desk. "Enough." The room fell silent. She turned to her aide. "Has the human envoy responded?" "They have." The aide hesitated. "The wolves have refused recall orders. They say their job isn't finished." Velvotha's fur bristled. The humans were disobeying a direct command from the council. That could not be allowed. The wolves receive an ultimatum. On the surface of Torvin 6, Sergeant Vasquez sat cross-legged on the hood of a ruined transport vehicle, sharpening her knife. Around her, the wolves were already moving, scavenging, reloading, preparing for the next fight. Lieutenant Jensen approached, holding out a data pad. "New orders." Vasquez barely glanced at it. "Let me guess. The council's pissed." "More than pissed," Jensen said, scrolling through the message. "They're giving us a choice: stand down and return to council space, or be classified as rogue combatants." Vasquez smirked. "That's cute." "It gets cuter." Jensen held up a second transmission. "They've dispatched a peacekeeping fleet to ensure compliance." Now Vasquez stopped. "How big?" Jensen's expression darkened. "Heavy carriers. Armed escorts. Enough firepower to glass this entire moon." For a moment the wolves were silent. Then Vasquez laughed. "Guess the council finally realized they can't keep us on a leash," she said, sliding her knife back into its sheath. "About time." The wolves of Earth did not take orders. And they sure as hell did not retreat. The Council's fleet arrives. The Council's first peacekeeping armada arrived in system within hours, dropping from hyperspace like a hammer falling toward an anvil. Over 100 ships. A display of force meant to break any resistance before it even began. Admiral Givor, a veteran of over 50 campaigns, sat in the command chair of the dreadnought Celestial Authority, watching as his fleet formed a blockade over Torvin 6. His orders were clear. The humans would surrender, or they would burn. Open a channel to the wolves, he commanded. A moment later, Vasquez's face appeared on screen. She was sitting in the same damn spot, leaning lazily against her ruined transport, her knife flipping between her fingers. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and outmaneuvered, Givor stated. Lay down your weapons. This does not have to end in bloodshed. Vasquez smiled. Oh, Admiral. That's where you're wrong. She leaned forward. This was always going to end in bloodshed. The transmission cut. And the wolves attacked. A war they never expected. The first peacekeeping armada had been built for planetary control, not urban warfare. They had expected negotiations. Surrender. Order. Instead they got chaos. From the moment the battle began, it was clear. The wolves did not fight like any army the Council had ever faced. The Council's ground troops deployed in standard formations. The wolves struck from the shadows, setting ambushes in the ruins of the city, luring enemy squads into kill zones where they were torn apart by precision fire and explosives. Council tanks rolled into position, their plasma cannons obliterating buildings, but the wolves did not fight from buildings. They fought under them, around them, over them. They used the wreckage as their hunting grounds. Snipers picked off officers from impossible distances. Grenades turned supply routes into graveyards. And in the thick of the chaos, Vasquez led the charge, blade in one hand, rifle in the other, a whirlwind of death in the streets of Torvin 6. It was not a battle. It was an execution. The fleet breaks. Above the battlefield, the Celestial Authority shuddered as an explosion tore through its lower decks. Admiral Givor spun to his officers. What the hell was that? Explosions on multiple decks. Hull breaches reported. How? There's no enemy fleet. A new voice cut in, panicked. Sir, the wolves are on board. Givor's blood ran cold. That's impossible. But it wasn't. The moment the Council had deployed their troops, the wolves had launched boarding teams. Stealth drops. Precision infiltrations. While the battle raged on the surface, they had climbed into the beast's belly. One by one, Council ships began to fall. Their own security teams were overwhelmed. Their weapons were turned against them. Admiral Givor watched in horror as his mighty armada, the force meant to control the humans, was being torn apart from within. This wasn't just a rebellion. It was a massacre. A message to the Council. The battle ended before sunrise. Torvin 6 was now human territory. The first peacekeeping armada was in ruins. The survivors, those lucky enough to still be breathing, were allowed to leave. But only after delivering a message. A warning. Vasquez stood in the wreckage of the Council's flagship, broadcasting to the entire galaxy. We were never your pets, she said, her voice carrying across the stars. You called us tamed. You tried to control us. She leaned closer. Now, you've made us angry. She smiled. And you're about to find out what happens when the wolves of Earth stop playing nice. The Council had sent their fleet to tame the wolves of Earth. Instead they had fed them. Torvin 6 belonged to the humans now. The shattered remnants of the first peacekeeping armada had fled, what was left of them. But the wolves weren't finished. They were just getting started. The hunt begins. Across the ruins of the former battlefront, the wolves moved like predators through the dark. Their work wasn't done. Secure the remaining supplies. Kill any survivors too dumb to run, Vasquez ordered, stepping over the still smoking remains of a Council walker. Jensen nodded. And the prisoners? Vasquez smirked. We don't take prisoners. Jensen didn't ask again. The Council's response. News of the Wolves' massacre spread through the galactic networks like wildfire. The Council had expected a rebellion crushed, a lesson taught. Instead, they had suffered a humiliation so total it shook the foundations of their rule. Chancellor Velvoth watched the reports in grim silence, her claws digging into the armrest of her chair. The once invincible first peacekeeping armada had been slaughtered. And the wolves weren't stopping. They must be exterminated, hissed the Kelthai delegate, his voice shaking with fury. The entire species if necessary. The humans will not be controlled, Velvoth growled. We should have realized it sooner. Then what do we do? Demanded another voice. If we cannot tame them, we must eradicate them. The council chamber fell into a fearful silence. Then Velvoth spoke. We make them an offer. The room erupted into chaos. The wolves receive a final offer. The transmission reached the wolves a day later. Sergeant Vasquez stood at the edge of a ruined balcony, staring at the broken city below as the Chancellor's final message played on the battered comms screen. You have proven that humanity is not to be underestimated, Velvoth said, her tone carefully measured. You have won your war. But you cannot win the next one. Jensen leaned closer. She's bluffing. Vasquez let the message play. We offer a choice, Velvoth continued. Return to Earth. Live as warriors, unchallenged in your own system. The Council will withdraw. No retribution. No consequences. Vasquez raised an eyebrow. Jensen scoffed. And if we say no? The Chancellor's eyes darkened. Then we will stop treating you as an inconvenience. The message cut. Silence hung in the air. Then Vasquez laughed. Did she really just threaten us? She grinned, flipping her knife between her fingers. Jensen smirked. I think so. Then I guess she didn't learn the lesson. Vasquez turned, eyes gleaming. Let's teach it again. Earth responds. While the wolves had carved their legend into Torvin 6, Earth had been watching. And preparing. The moment the Council's final offer was transmitted, humanity's leaders made their own decision. A simple one. They denied it. And in the shadow of Earth's orbit, an armada prepared to launch. This was no rogue band of mercenaries. No small force of insurgents. This was the Terran fleet. The wolves had bled the Council. Now Earth was coming to finish the job. The galactic war begins. As the first human warships burned toward Council space, Vasquez grinned up at the stars. They thought they had been fighting a pack of feral beasts. But this was never just a pack. This was a species of predators. And now the hunt had truly begun. To be continued. The wolves had drawn first blood. But the war for the galaxy was just beginning. Want to see what happens when the wolves take the fight to the Council's doorstep? Subscribe now.